Picture the Adriatic in the 3rd century BC, not the postcard sea of summer ferries and coastal resorts, but a narrow, contested corridor where merchant ships hugged the coastline for safety and still disappeared without explanation. This was a sea defined by its geography. A long enclosed stretch of water squeezing between the Italian peninsula on one side and the rugged, island-studded Dalmatian coast on the other, funneling every cargo of grain, wine, timber, and silver through a bottleneck at its southern end, where the Otranto Strait opened into the broader Mediterranean world. Greeks had planted colonies along its eastern shore, Epidamnos, Issa, others, turning those ports into prosperous outposts of Hellenistic civilization. Rome, expanding steadily down the Italian coast, was beginning to understand that whoever controlled this sea controlled the movement of wealth between east and west, and there was a third power watching all of it, drawn by the same logic but operating by entirely different rules. The Illyrians occupied the mountains and inlets of the eastern Adriatic coast, and for generations they had treated the sea not as a barrier but as a resource. Their shallow, fast vessels, called lemboi, were built for exactly the kind of work that made Greek and Italian merchants wake up in the night. They were raiding ships, coastal attackers, pirate craft by almost any definition, and the kingdoms that fielded them had quietly institutionalized plunder as something close to economic policy. By around 250 BC, a king named Agron had taken this tradition and transformed it into something more deliberate and more dangerous. His Ardean kingdom, centered on the Dalmatian coast near what is now Split, became a genuine naval power. He expanded his fleet, pushed south along the coast, and in one audacious operation captured the Epirate city of Phoenice, demonstrating that Illyrian ambition now extended well beyond opportunistic raiding into something resembling conquest. The eastern Adriatic had a new dominant force, and it was not yet finished growing. Then, around 231 BC, Agron died. The cause, according to ancient sources, was excess celebration following his military successes, pleuritis brought on by heavy drinking, which is the kind of detail ancient historians offered when they wanted to make a point about character. Whatever the exact circumstances, his death created a crisis of succession, because his heir was a young boy named Pin, far too young to rule. Into that gap stepped Teuta. She was Agron's wife, his queen, and she assumed the regency for her stepson with what appears to have been little internal opposition and considerable external ambition. Ancient sources, particularly Polybius, call her queen outright, though modern scholars have pointed out that the more technically accurate title is regent, a distinction that mattered enormously in the ancient world and matters still for how we interpret her authority and the choices she made. Whether she ruled as sovereign in her own right or as a guardian holding power for a child, the practical reality was the same. Teuta commanded the Illyrian fleet, directed its raids, and set the course of a kingdom that was now on a collision course with Rome. That collision is the story at the heart of this video, and it raises 3 questions worth sitting with before we go any further. Who exactly was Teuta? What do the ancient sources actually tell us? Where do they disagree? And how much does gender bias in those accounts distort the picture we've inherited? How did Illyrian piracy function not as random lawlessness, but as a deliberate instrument of state power, woven into the political economy of the kingdom itself? And why did Rome, a republic that had never before projected military force beyond the Italian peninsula, decide that this woman and her fleet were worth crossing the sea to fight? The arc that answers those questions moves from the Dalmatian coast to the Greek colonies, trembling under Illyrian raids, through a diplomatic encounter that ended in blood and ignited a war, across the Adriatic with the largest Roman fleet assembled to that point, and finally to a peace settlement that stripped Teuta of her southern territories and her freedom of movement on the sea. It moves from there into something stranger and more lasting, the legend of a queen who leapt from a mountaintop rather than submit, a story preserved not in Roman annals but in local memory, and the modern commemorations in Albania that have turned Teuta into something the ancient sources never quite intended, a national symbol, a figure of resistance, her face on a coin. There is also a historiographic problem running through all of it, one worth naming early. Almost everything we know about Teuta comes from sources who were not Illyrian, did not speak her language, and had very specific reasons for portraying her the way they did. Polybius, Appian, Cassius Dio. These are Roman and Greek writers recording a story in which Rome is the civilizing force and Teuta is the obstacle. When they describe her as rash, arrogant, blinded by passion, or unable to control the men around her, we should read those characterizations carefully, because they reveal as much about the biases of the historians as they do about the woman herself. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. Now, back to the 3rd century BC, to a sea full of fast ships and dangerous ambitions, and to the moment when a woman no one in Rome had ever heard of became the reason they built a fleet and sailed east for the very first time. To understand what Teuta inherited, and why it was worth fighting over, you have to spend a moment with the sea itself. The Adriatic is not a large ocean. It stretches roughly 800 kilometres from its northern reaches near Venice down to the Strait of Otranto in the south, where it narrows to just 72 kilometres before opening into the Ionian Sea and the broader Mediterranean beyond. That funnel at the bottom is not incidental. It is the whole point. Every ship carrying grain from Egypt, timber from Macedonia, silver from the Balkans, or wine from Greece that wanted to reach Italian markets had to pass through that corridor. The Strait of Otranto was, in practical terms, a toll booth that nature had built, and whoever controlled the coast above it controlled the flow of commerce across the central Mediterranean. The western shore of the Adriatic, the Italian side, is relatively featureless. Long beaches, gentle gradients, few natural harbours of consequence. The eastern side is something else entirely. The Dalmatian coast is one of the most dramatically fragmented coastlines in the world, a labyrinth of islands, peninsulas, hidden channels, and deep inlets carved by the same geological forces that pushed the Dinaric Alps into the sea. Islands like Pharos, Isa, Brash, and Korčula sit scattered like stepping stones down the coast, creating sheltered anchorages invisible from the open water and channels that only local sailors knew how to navigate without running aground. For a merchant, this coastline was a nightmare. For a pirate, it was a gift. The Greeks had understood the value of the eastern Adriatic long before the Illyrian kingdoms rose to dominate it. As far back as the 7th and 6th centuries BC, Greek colonists, primarily from Corinth and Corcyra, had planted footholds along the coast and its approaches. Epidamnos, founded around 627 BC at the site later known as Dyrrachium, grew into a prosperous trading city at the edge of the Illyrian world, a place where Greek merchants exchanged manufactured goods for the raw materials flowing out of the Balkan interior. Apollonia, founded around 600 BC a little further south along the Ours River valley, served a similar function, acting as a gateway between the Greek commercial network and the tribal kingdoms of the hinterland. These were not frontier outposts living in fear. They were wealthy, well-connected cities, anchoring a string of commercial relationships that tied the eastern Adriatic to the wider Hellenistic economy. But wealth and stability are not the same thing, and this coastline had never been genuinely stable. The political landscape of Illyria was a patchwork of tribal kingdoms, the Ardeae, the Taulanti, the Encelel, the Dardani among them, each with its own leadership, its own territory, and its own understanding of where legitimate authority ended and opportunistic violence began. These were not static entities with fixed borders. Strong chieftains absorbed weaker neighbours, alliances formed and collapsed, and the sea between the islands provided both a buffer and a highway depending on who was sailing it. The neighbouring powers, Macedon pressing from the east, Epirus from the south, the growing shadow of Rome from the west, all watched the region carefully, because whoever sat astride that island-riddled coast could threaten or extort almost anyone passing through. What made the eastern Adriatic so difficult for outside observers to manage was precisely this coexistence of commerce and predation. Greek merchants regularly called at ports like Isa and Dyrrachium, trading openly and profitably. The same coastline, the same islands, the same channels sheltered Illyrian light galleys that would intercept those merchants on the open water with no particular apology. Ancient sources describe these raids not as the work of outlaws operating against the wishes of their rulers, but as a recognized feature of Illyrian political economy. Raiding was how kingdoms enriched themselves, rewarded warriors, and demonstrated power. To the Greeks and increasingly to Rome, this looked like chaos dressed up as governance. To the Illyrians, it was simply how the sea worked. By the time Agron consolidated Ardean power in the mid-3rd century BC, the eastern Adriatic had been simmering in this condition for generations. Greek cities were prosperous but anxious. Illyrian kingdoms were powerful but fragmented. The major regional powers were preoccupied with their own ambitions and had yet to commit serious resources to bringing order to the Adriatic corridor. The sea was, as one ancient observer might have put it, rich and ungoverned, and that combination, as history tends to confirm, never stays quiet for long. It was into exactly this world that Agron arrived with larger ambitions than anyone before him, and it was this world that Teuta would inherit, weaponize, and ultimately wager against Rome. Agron did not inherit a minor chieftaincy and slowly nurse it into something greater. He arrived on the scene of Illyrian politics as a force of consolidation, a ruler with the ambition and the military instinct to transform what had been a patchwork of competing tribal powers into something that looked, from the outside, uncomfortably like an empire. Under his reign, which stretched from roughly 250 to 231 BC, the Ardean kingdom went from being one significant player along the eastern Adriatic to being the dominant power from the Nerona River in the north down to the Aus in the south, a stretch of coastline that encompassed the most strategically vital waters in the central Mediterranean. The key to Agron's expansion was not simply land warfare, though he was capable enough at that. It was the sea. He understood, with a clarity that distinguishes genuinely talented rulers from merely ambitious ones, that the Dalmatian coast was not a barrier to power, but its primary instrument. Those fragmented channels, hidden inlets, and island chains that made Greek merchants sweat and Roman administrators uneasy were, in the right hands, a naval infrastructure more valuable than any stone fortress. Agron invested heavily in building a fleet suited to exploiting that geography. Fast, shallow-draft galleys known as lembi, designed specifically for the confined waters of the Dalmatian archipelago, capable of projecting force quickly and then vanishing back into the coastal maze before any heavier warship could respond. The scale of what he assembled becomes concrete in a single episode that Polybius records in his histories. When Agron intervened in a conflict involving the city of Medion, he dispatched a fleet of 100 lembi carrying approximately 5,000 men, a rapid amphibious force that executed a surprise attack with the kind of coordinated precision that does not improvise itself into existence overnight. This was not a raiding party. This was a military instrument that had been deliberately built, funded, crewed, and rehearsed. The Median operation demonstrated in the starkest possible terms that Agron had created something new on the Adriatic, a kingdom with genuine naval striking power, capable of projecting force far from its home harbours on short notice. That fleet was not cheap to maintain, and here the relationship between conquest, tribute, and sea raiding becomes essential to understanding how Agron's kingdom actually functioned as a going concern. Between roughly 233 and 231 BC, he gathered what ancient sources describe as a formidable fleet and began sanctioning naval operations against Greek city-states along the coast. These were not random acts of opportunistic brigandage, they were extensions of state policy, conducted with Agron's explicit blessing and organized through the same command structures that ran his conventional military campaigns. The wealth extracted from newly subjugated cities fed back into the fleet, paying for rowers, weapons, provisions, and maintenance. Conquest generated tribute. Tribute funded raiding. Raiding extended the reach of conquest. The cycle was elegant in a predatory way, and it worked. The territorial gains were substantial. Agron extended his kingdom's reach into Epirus, seized control of Epidamnus, one of the great Greek trading cities of the coast, and most significantly, established Ardean garrisons on the islands of Corcyra and Pharos. Corcyra, modern Corfu, sits at the very mouth of the Adriatic, the last island before the strait opens into the Ionian Sea. Any power holding Corcyra could, in principle, observe or threaten almost every ship entering or leaving the Adriatic. To garrison, it was to place a hand on the throat of the entire sea's commerce. To the Greek cities and the merchants who served them, this was alarming. To Agron, it was precisely the point. His greatest military triumph came in 231 BC, when he inflicted a significant defeat on the Aetolian League, one of the major confederate powers of the Greek world at the time. The victory consolidated his reputation confirmed his dominance over the southern Adriatic corridor, and signalled to every regional power that the Ardean kingdom was now too large and too capable to be ignored or managed through half measures. For a moment, Agron must have seemed almost unstoppable, a ruler who had transformed a coastal kingdom into a naval empire in the space of a generation, whose fleet controlled the most valuable sea lanes in the region, whose armies had humbled one of the Greek world's most formidable military coalitions, and then he died. Not in battle, not through treachery or intrigue, but from pleurisy, an inflammation of the chest, probably brought on by the celebrations that followed his victory over the Aetolians. Ancient sources suggest that the feasting and drinking that marked his triumph contributed to his physical collapse. It is one of history's more ironic endings. A king whose military energy had reshaped an entire coastline, undone not by an enemy sword but by the consequences of his own victory banquet. He was likely still in his prime when it happened, and the suddenness of his death meant that the succession arrangements were, at best, incomplete. What he left behind was a kingdom of remarkable power and considerable fragility. The Ardean realm was large, but large in the way that fast conquests tend to produce. Territories stitched together through force and intimidation, rather than integrated administration, garrison towns that required constant assertion of authority to remain loyal, tribute arrangements that depended on the continued credibility of Ardean military power to be honoured. Agron had built the engine and pressed the accelerator. He had not necessarily had time to build the brakes, or to design the kind of institutional structures that allow a kingdom to survive a sudden change in ruler without missing a beat. The throne passed to his son Pin. The problem was that Pin's was a child, a young boy in no position to command armies, negotiate with restive cities, or project the personal authority that held Agron's patchwork of conquests in place. In the ancient world, a child king was not simply a political inconvenience, he was an invitation. Neighbouring powers recalculated their options. Subordinate chieftains reconsidered their loyalties. Cities that had submitted to Agron's force began to wonder whether the force was still real. A child on the throne meant that the kingdom's power was, for the moment, more theoretical than practical, and the Adriatic had never been a sea that rewarded theoretical power. Into this precarious moment stepped Agron's second wife, the woman who would serve as regent in Pin's name, and in doing so become one of the most controversial figures in the ancient Mediterranean world. Her name was Teuta. The exact nature of her authority is something that ancient sources are careful, or perhaps careless, about specifying. Polybius, Appian, and Cassius Dio describe her in ways that sometimes imply the full dignity of a ruling queen, and sometimes reduce her to a temporary caretaker, whose actions they characterize as reckless or emotionally driven. The question of whether she was a queen in her own right, or a regent acting for her stepson, matters, because it shapes how we interpret everything she subsequently did. Whether her decisions were the sovereign policies of a ruler, or the overreach of a woman exercising authority that ancient observers felt she was not entitled to hold. That uncertainty runs through every account of her, and it is worth keeping in mind as we follow what happened next. What is not uncertain is the position she inherited. The kingdom was powerful on paper, vulnerable in practice, surrounded by watching eyes, and dependent for its coherence on the continued projection of military and naval strength. The fleet Agron had built was real. The tribute flowing from subjugated cities was real. The fear that Ardean Lembi inspired along the coast was real. But all of it needed a steady hand and unambiguous authority to remain intact. Teuta took the helm of a kingdom that was, at the same moment, genuinely formidable and genuinely exposed, and she would spend the years ahead making absolutely certain that no one on the Adriatic, least of all Rome, mistook the one for the other. The world Teuta stepped into in 231 BC did not offer the luxury of a gradual transition. Agron's death had been sudden enough that the machinery of the kingdom, the fleets at anchor, the garrisons holding subjugated cities, the tribute flows from Greek towns that had submitted to Ardean power, all of it continued moving forward under its own momentum. But momentum alone does not govern an empire. Someone had to make decisions, and quickly, because the watching world had already begun to recalibrate. The question of what title to attach to her matters more than it might initially seem. Polybius, our most detailed ancient source for this period, uses language that grants her something close to the full dignity of a reigning monarch. He portrays her in command, issuing orders, receiving embassies, directing policy, the functional picture of a sovereign ruler. Appian, writing later, is less generous with the title, treating her more explicitly as a regent acting in Pins's name, a temporary custodian of power rather than its holder. The Oxford Classical Dictionary entry on Teuta is careful to note this divergence, acknowledging that the title dispute is not merely a semantic quibble, but a genuine historiographic problem that shapes everything that follows. If she was a queen in her own right, her decisions carry the full weight of sovereign policy. If she was a regent, ancient observers, and some modern ones, find it easier to characterize those same decisions as overreach, as the misjudgments of someone exercising authority beyond what was properly hers to hold. The honest answer is that the distinction may have been less clear in practice than either ancient or modern commentators prefer. In the immediate aftermath of Agron's death, what mattered was not the formal title inscribed on any document, but the practical reality of who was directing Ardean power. Teuta was directing it. She controlled the fleet. She commanded the armies. She negotiated, threatened, and acted, and in the ancient world that kind of functional sovereignty tends to be its own argument. The debate over whether to call her queen or regent tells us less about what she actually held than it does about the discomfort her authority produced in the men who later wrote about her. The early months of her rule confronted her with challenges of the kind that might have tempted a more cautious figure to consolidate rather than expand. There was internal unrest, Illyrian rebellion that required military attention and political management, and the siege of the Greek island Issa, which had been pressing before Agron's death, still demanded resolution. A Roman embassy was already on its way, carrying demands that the Ardean kingdom pull back from its raids on Italian and Greek merchant shipping. The diplomatic pressure, the internal instability, and the ongoing military operations on multiple fronts arrived simultaneously, in the way that crises always seem to when a new ruler has barely had time to find their footing. What Teuta did not do is perhaps as revealing as what she did. She did not retreat. She did not signal a policy reversal, did not attempt to purchase a breathing space by offering concessions to the Roman embassy or pulling back the fleet to reassure nervous Greek cities. The aggressive maritime strategy that Agron had built, the state-sanctioned raiding, the systematic extraction of tribute from coastal cities, the deliberate use of naval power to dominate the Adriatic's trade routes, she continued it without meaningful interruption. The momentum Agron had built was not simply preserved, it was extended. Attacks on Greek colonies proceeded. The fleet kept moving. The pressure on cities like Phoenice, one of the wealthiest Greek settlements in the region, intensified rather than eased. This continuity of policy tells us something important about Teuta's own understanding of the kingdom she had inherited. Agron's system worked because it was dynamic. Stopping it, even temporarily, would have looked like weakness to the subordinate chieftains watching for signs that the new leadership could maintain authority. The tribute flowed because cities believed the alternative was worse. The moment that belief weakened, the entire financial architecture of the fleet, and therefore the fleet itself, began to erode. Teuta understood that the predatory logic Agron had constructed could not be paused without unraveling. The engine had to keep running. There is something worth dwelling on in how decisively she grasped that logic, because the ancient sources, particularly Polybius, go to considerable lengths to suggest she did not grasp it at all. His portrait of Teuta is one of the more revealing examples of a recurring pattern in Greco-Roman historical writing. The powerful woman framed not as a capable ruler, making rational strategic choices, but as an impulsive figure whose decisions flow from emotional excess rather than political calculation. He attributes to her explicitly a woman's natural shortness of view, a phrase that tells us precisely nothing about Teuta and a great deal about Polybius, about the intellectual framework he carried into his work, and about the way ancient writers processed the dissonance between a woman's evident authority and their conviction that such authority was inherently suspect. It is a trope with deep roots in the ancient world. Powerful women in Greek and Roman historical writing, Cleopatra, Artemisia, later Boudica, tend to be portrayed through a particular lens. They are reckless where male rulers are decisive, transgressive where male rulers are merely ambitious, driven by passion where male rulers are driven by policy. The narrative function of this framing is to make female power legible in ways that do not disturb the underlying assumption that power is properly male. If Teuta's decisions were aggressive, they could not simply be strategic. They had to be rash. If she was bold, that boldness had to be redescribed as imprudence. The historical irony is that the very decisions Polybius characterizes as evidence of her short-sightedness, the continuation of maritime raiding, the confrontational stance toward Rome, the refusal to immediately capitulate to Roman demands, are precisely the decisions a competent ruler would have made, given the structural imperatives of the Ardeian kingdom's economy and the signal value of appearing unintimidated to an audience of subordinate Illyrian chieftains, watching closely for any sign of hesitation. That Polybius's gendered framing has influenced subsequent scholarship is not surprising. Ancient sources shape the questions historians ask for centuries afterward, and the image of Teuta as a reckless regent rather than a calculating sovereign has had considerable staying power. Scholars working from the Oxford Classical Dictionary's entry forward have been more careful to flag the bias embedded in the primary sources, noting that the title dispute itself, Queen versus Regent, may reflect ancient discomfort with unambiguous female sovereignty as much as it reflects any genuine administrative reality. When a source is reluctant to call a ruling woman a queen even when she commands fleets and directs foreign policy, the reluctance is worth examining. What we can say with reasonable confidence, threading through the disagreements in the ancient record, is that Teuta in practice wielded full sovereign authority. She ordered fleets to move, she directed the seizure of ships, she met with foreign ambassadors and dictated terms, she responded to military crises with military decisions. When Rome eventually forced a treaty on the Ardeian kingdom, it was Teuta who negotiated it, a detail that would be incoherent if she were merely a passive regent without genuine executive power. The peace settlement would restrict her navy, limit the number of warships permitted beyond a specific point along the coast, and impose tribute payments. You do not negotiate such terms with a figurehead. The Teuta who emerges from the evidence, stripped as carefully as possible of the tendentious framing that surrounds her in ancient texts, is a ruler who inherited a dynamic, fragile, and inherently aggressive maritime kingdom, understood its logic well enough to continue it without hesitation, and held it together through a period of internal challenge and external pressure through the force of her own authority. Whether that authority derived from a title of queen or from the practical weight of the regent's role matters less than the fact of it. The fleet moved because she directed it. The Adriatic trembled because she willed it. That was the position she had consolidated by the time the Roman embassy arrived with its demands, and the manner in which she received them, and the consequences that followed, would set in motion a chain of events that neither she nor Rome had fully anticipated. But to understand why those consequences unfolded as they did, it is worth first understanding exactly what kind of power she had built on the water, and why piracy, for Teuta, was not a crime but a policy. To understand Teuta's Adriatic kingdom, you first have to dissolve a category that feels self-evident to modern readers, and felt equally self-evident to Roman ones. The word piracy carries with it an assumption of criminality, lawless violence outside the boundaries of legitimate state behaviour, the kind of activity that orderly societies suppress because it violates the principles by which maritime trade functions. That is the Roman frame, and it is largely the frame that has been carried forward through centuries of scholarship. But to apply it to Illyrian practice without interrogating it is to misread what was actually happening on the Adriatic in the 3rd century BC, and to misread it on precisely the terms that Rome preferred. For the Ardeian kingdom, raiding the sea was not a failure of governance. It was governance. It was the mechanism through which the kingdom funded itself, paid its soldiers, rewarded loyal commanders, projected power over subordinate cities, and financed the construction of the very fleet that made all of those things possible. What Roman sources called piracy, Illyrian leaders called policy, and the distinction was not merely semantic. It reflected two genuinely different political traditions, and two genuinely different relationships to the sea. The instrument of this policy was the lembos, a light, fast galley that could be crewed by up to 100 men, roughly half working the oars, half ready to board. The lembos was not a vessel designed for long ocean passages or the transport of heavy cargo. It was a weapon. Low in the water, difficult to spot at distance, capable of bursts of speed that heavier merchant vessels could not match, it was perfectly optimized for the work it was given, running down grain ships and trading vessels crossing the Adriatic, coming alongside before the crew had time to respond, taking the cargo and sometimes the crew themselves as slaves, and disappearing back toward the Illyrian coast before any response could be organized. The Roman and Greek sources describe these raids almost clinically as the taking of booty from the sea, a phrase that, whatever its exact translation across ancient texts, captures something true about how the Illyrians conceptualized the practice. The sea was a resource, and its traffic was a harvest. That harvest was carefully structured. The Lemby crews were not freelance operators working on their own initiative. They functioned under a system that looks, in its broad outlines, recognizably like a licensed enterprise. The Crown issued what amounted to authorizations for plunder, permissions that transformed individual Illyrian captains and their crews into instruments of royal revenue extraction. A portion of the booty flowed back to the Ardiean treasury. In return, the captains operated with state backing, meaning their activities carried an implicit threat. To interfere with an Illyrian raiding crew was to interfere with the Ardiean kingdom itself. The line between piracy and naval warfare was, for practical purposes, non-existent. The raiding fleet was the war fleet, and the war fleet was the raiding fleet. One institution served both functions simultaneously. This was the system Teuta had inherited and was expanding. And when Roman ambassadors came to her demanding that the raids on their merchants stop, she reportedly told them something that reads as scandalous in every ancient source that transmits it, but was, in context, a perfectly lucid statement of constitutional reality. She told them it was an ancient custom of Illyrian rulers not to interfere with the private actions of their citizens in taking plunder from the sea. Whether those exact words are authentic or a Roman period reconstruction matters less than what they reveal about how Teuta understood the relationship between her crown and her fleet. She was not defending lawlessness, she was describing a system. The raiders who attacked merchant vessels in the Adriatic were not criminals evading her authority. They were operating within an established framework that her authority had sanctioned, and from which her treasury derived direct benefit. This is the point where Roman outrage and Illyrian logic diverge most sharply, and where the misreading becomes most consequential. Roman sources, Polybius most prominently, reach for the vocabulary of violation. The law of nations transgressed, the safety of traders destroyed, the natural order of commerce disrupted. That language is not insincere. Roman senators genuinely believed that maritime trade operated within a framework of mutual obligations that Illyrian raiding was tearing apart. But that belief was also convenient because it cast Rome as the defender of universal principles rather than as one interested party among several with conflicting economic agendas. The Ardiean kingdom was not violating a universally recognized legal order. It was operating according to its own recognized legal order, one that happened to extract wealth from people whose home city had recently become powerful enough to object. Teuta's use of the sea as a political weapon extended well beyond the harassment of merchant shipping. The same fleet that raided cargo vessels was deployed to pressure coastal cities in far more direct ways. The rich Greek colony of Phoenice in Epirus was seized outright, captured by Illyrian forces and stripped of enough wealth to fund a substantial portion of the kingdom's military operations for the following season. Issa, the Greek island colony in the Adriatic, was subjected to sustained pressure that forced it to seek external protection. Corcyra and Epidamnus both came under attack, their positions on the trade routes making them attractive targets and strategic pressure points simultaneously. In each case, the naval capacity built through years of systematic raiding was being converted into direct territorial and financial leverage over communities that had previously operated beyond the Ardiean kingdom's reach. The economic logic of this escalation is worth following carefully. Raiding individual merchant vessels generates revenue that is real but incremental. A cargo here, a shipload of grain there, the proceeds distributed among the crew and the crown, and spent quickly enough on provisions and maintenance. Raiding a city generates the kind of lump sum wealth that can fund a campaign, pay off a garrison, build a new class of warship, or purchase the loyalty of a subordinate chieftain whose allegiance has been wavering. Teuta was not simply continuing Agron's policy for its own sake. She was using the fleet's established capacity for violence to move up the scale of what the violence could produce. The sea raids funded the naval power. The naval power enabled the coastal seizures. The coastal seizures funded the expansion of the fleet and the army that together made the whole system credible. It was a feedback loop, and as long as it kept turning, the Ardiean kingdom grew. Greek city-states along the Adriatic and Ionian coasts had been suffering under this system for years before Rome's attention sharpened. Their protests had generated diplomatic noise but no decisive response. The raids on their merchants and the pressure on their colonial cities were real and damaging, but they did not rise to the level of threatening any power large enough to act decisively against the Ardean fleet. This is the pattern that had allowed Illyrian maritime raiding to expand without serious check for a generation or more. The victims were real, but none of them was powerful enough to make their suffering matter. That calculus changed when Illyrian vessels began following the trade routes westward into the Ionian Sea and targeting Italian merchant shipping. The Italian traders whose cargo was being taken had connections, political networks, and the ear of a Senate that was already attentive to anything that disrupted the commerce flowing through Rome's increasingly influential network of allies and trading partners. Each cargo lost to a Lembo's crew was a grievance delivered to Roman ears. The complaints accumulated. The Senate began receiving petitions from merchants and their representatives with a regularity that was impossible to ignore. What had been a regional problem for Greek colonists who lacked the power to make Rome care had quietly become a Roman problem. And Rome, unlike the Greek cities, had both the power and the political will to do something about it. The threshold had shifted. Illyrian raiding had always been a predatory system operating at someone else's expense, and for a long time, the someones it operated at were not powerful enough to force a reckoning. The moment Italian trade interest entered the ledger, that comfortable margin evaporated. The same policy that had funded Teuta's expansion rewarded her commanders and extended Ardean power across the eastern Adriatic had now pulled a force into the conflict that neither she nor any of her predecessors had ever had to contend with directly. The Adriatic, which the Ardean kingdom had treated as its own economic domain, was about to become something else. The approach route for a Roman fleet whose construction Teuta's own raids had, in a profound and unintended sense, helped to finance. The cities that bore the first weight of this expanding pressure were not abstractions on a map. They were places with harbours full of fishing boats and merchant vessels, with warehouses stacked against the water, with populations that had built their wealth over generations through the slow accumulation of trade relationships stretching across the Adriatic and beyond. To understand what Teuta's campaigns meant in practice, you need to stand in those harbours and watch the horizon. Phoenice was one of the richest cities in Epirus, and a pirate trading hub that had grown prosperous precisely because of its position as a waypoint between the Greek world and the Italian coast. It was the kind of city that attracted merchants from both directions, a place where goods moved and money changed hands, and the practical business of Adriatic commerce was conducted daily. When Teuta's general Scodra brought Illyrian forces against it around 230 BC, the city fell with a completeness that sent a message far beyond Epirus itself. The wealth stripped from Phoenice was enormous, enough to make the operation worth repeating, and enough to demonstrate to every other coastal settlement, watching from a safe distance, that no city was beyond reach simply because it had walls, and a population and long-standing commercial ties to powerful neighbours. What had seemed like natural protection, geography, history, reputation, turned out to be insufficient against a fleet that moved faster than diplomatic response and struck before warning could be organised and transmitted into meaningful resistance. The fall of Phoenice reverberated. Greek colonies along the Adriatic coast began recalculating their own exposure, and what they calculated was not reassuring. The island colony of Issa, modern Vis sitting off the Dalmatian coast, had long maintained its identity as a prosperous Greek foundation, part of that scattered network of maritime communities whose collective reach made the Adriatic feel, to the Greeks who traded across it, like something manageable and familiar. Teuta's forces subjected Issa to a siege that stretched across the better part of a year, somewhere between 230 and 229 BC, depending on which ancient account you weight more heavily. Polybius placing the operations in one sequence, Appian in a slightly different one. What both agree on is the sustained nature of the pressure. This was not a raid. It was a deliberate campaign to bring a strategically positioned island community to submission, and it lasted long enough that Issa's residents had time to watch the months pass and wonder whether help would ever arrive. The people of Issa did what communities do when facing a threat they cannot handle alone. They sent for help, reaching out to Rome at a moment when the siege was still active and the outcome still uncertain. That the Roman embassy arrived while Issa was still under siege is itself significant. It means that Teuta's forces and the first serious Roman diplomatic attention to the Adriatic were simultaneous events, overlapping in the same stretch of months, which compressed the timeline between grievance and response in ways that would have enormous consequences. Meanwhile, Corcyra, the large island the Romans would come to know as Corfu, sitting at the mouth of the Adriatic like a key in a lock, had already been brought under Illyrian control, with a garrison installed to hold it. Pharos, another Adriatic island, had been similarly seized in the years of Agron's great naval expansion, its population subjected to Illyrian authority, and its harbour repurposed as a staging point for operations deeper into the Ionian Sea. The geography of what Teuta's kingdom now controlled was not a random scattering of acquisitions. It was a chain, islands and coastal points commanding the sea lanes that connected Greece, Sicily and Italy, a network of positions from which Illyrian forces could monitor, intercept, or simply threaten the merchant traffic moving through the central Mediterranean. This is where the fear became systemic rather than episodic. Individual raids on merchant ships were frightening for the traders who experienced them, but a merchant who survived a bad season could change routes, wait for better conditions, hire armed escorts, accept the losses as a cost of doing business in a dangerous sea. What Teuta's campaigns had created by 229 BC was something qualitatively different, a situation in which the sea lanes themselves were compromised at the structural level, because the islands and harbours that merchant navigation depended on for shelter, resupply and orientation were now either held by Illyrian forces or within easy raiding distance of fleets that operated from those held positions. You could not simply route around the problem. The problem was the route. Polybius, writing from a perspective deeply sympathetic to Rome and broadly hostile to Illyria, nonetheless preserves details that illuminate the scale of the disruption. He records that Illyrian ships operating from Phoenice and the surrounding coast plundered, murdered or carried off alive the crews and passengers of vessels sailing from Italy, a formulation that captures the range of violence being applied and the comprehensiveness of the threat. Merchants were not merely losing cargo, they were losing ships, losing crews, losing years of accumulated capital in a single engagement, or disappearing entirely from the record of people who had set out from a port and simply never arrived. The terror was real, and it was cumulative, because each disappearance fed the uncertainty that made every subsequent voyage more fraught and more expensive. For the Greek colonists who had been living under this pressure longest, there was an additional dimension of humiliation. These were communities that understood themselves as heirs to a Mediterranean civilization that had, for centuries, set the cultural and commercial terms of Adriatic life. They had founded their colonies, established their trade networks, built their temples and their civic institutions, and watched the sea serve them. To have that sea become hostile, to watch Illyrian lembi work the shipping lanes without effective opposition, was not merely an economic blow. It was a challenge to the entire order of things that Greek colonial civilization represented. The appeals that Greek cities sent outward, to other Greek communities, to distant powers, to Rome, were not simply requests for military assistance. They were testimony to a failure of the Adriatic world to protect what it had built, and they carried with them an urgency born of watching that failure compound month after month. The strategic logic of Teuta's position was, from her perspective, genuinely strong. Control of Corcyra and Pharos gave her kingdom leverage that no purely mainland power could easily project against her. Warships need safe harbours, fresh water, and reliable resupply. Without island bases scattered through the operational area, a fleet is tethered to its home coast and cannot sustain extended campaigns far from that coast. By holding the islands, Teuta had effectively extended the operational range of Illyrian naval power across the whole upper and central Adriatic. What had been a regional kingdom with a coastline was becoming something closer to a maritime empire with nodes of power distributed across the sea itself. But that very success was generating a kind of strategic overreach that was difficult to perceive from inside it. Each new city brought under pressure, each island garrison installed, each trade route compromised, added to the list of grievances being compiled by communities that had now concluded that local solutions were inadequate. The Greek colonies had learned this lesson through bitter experience. The trading communities whose Italian merchants were being raided were learning it in real time. The Adriatic had stopped being a space where regional powers managed regional problems. It had become an arena whose instability was large enough and whose economic consequences were widespread enough to demand attention from a power operating on a different scale entirely. The coastal cities understood that before Rome did. They had been watching the horizon and adjusting to what they saw there for years. Rome was still coming to terms with what the horizon now contained, but the process of that reckoning had already begun, set in motion not by any Roman decision, but by the steady logic of Teuta's own expansion, which had made the Adriatic too important and too dangerous for the city on the Tiber to continue treating it as someone else's problem. For most of its history to this point, Rome had been a power defined by land. Its legions marched on roads, its wars were fought on Italian soil, against Italian neighbours, across Italian terrain that Roman commanders understood intimately, from a lifetime of campaigning within its boundaries. The sea had mattered, of course. Rome was not blind to its importance, but the sea had been something to secure at the margins rather than to master at the centre. The peninsula itself provided enough frontier, enough ambition, and enough danger to occupy Roman attention almost completely. That calculus had shifted once decisively during the long struggle against Carthage. The First Punic War, which ground on from 264 to 241 BC, had forced Rome into an entirely unfamiliar relationship with the sea. Rome built fleets it had no tradition of building, developed naval tactics it had no experience of executing, and discovered, through tremendous loss and eventual hard-won victory, that a Mediterranean power that could not fight on water was ultimately a vulnerable one. By the time the war ended, Rome possessed something it had never previously had, a substantial navy and the institutional memory of how to use it. The colony of Brundisium, established on the heel of the Italian boot in 246 BC, was part of the same strategic thinking, a fortified presence on the Adriatic coast, positioned to watch the Otranto Strait, that narrow passage between the Italian and Illyrian shores where the Adriatic opens into the Ionian Sea. Rome had placed a sentinel at the eastern door of its coastline, but for years that sentinel reported nothing that required the Senate to look directly at what lay beyond it. What changed was not a single catastrophic event, but the accumulation of smaller ones, each individually manageable, collectively impossible to ignore. Italian merchants operating the Adriatic routes began bringing back accounts that followed a consistent and disturbing pattern. Ships were intercepted by fast Illyrian lembi, those shallow-drafted, double-banked vessels that moved with a speed and agility that heavier merchant craft could not match. Cargoes were seized. Crews were killed, taken captive, or simply lost, the ships disappearing into that category of vessels that had departed from a port and never arrived. Polybius, in his account of these years, does not soften the record. He describes Illyrian forces operating along the Italian-connected sea lanes as forces that plundered, murdered, and carried off alive the people they encountered. It was not piracy in the episodic sense that traders had long accepted as a background risk. It was systematic, persistent, and growing worse as Teuta's campaigns extended Illyrian reach further down the Adriatic coast and into waters closer to Italy itself. The commercial consequences were compounding in ways that Rome's merchant community felt directly. Every seized ship represented not merely cargo lost but capital destroyed, insurance calculations revised upward, routes reconsidered, sailings delayed. The men who made their livelihoods from the Adriatic trade were not senators, but they were connected to senators, and the interests of Italian commerce had a way of reaching Roman deliberation through the practical language of disrupted business and absent ships. Rome had not built a Mediterranean empire yet, but it understood enough about commerce to recognize that a sea made systematically dangerous was a sea that was costing something real. Then came the appeals from the Greek cities, and they carried a different kind of urgency. The voice of settled ancient communities describing themselves as being strangled by forces they could not resist alone. Issa, still under siege, sent word to Rome. Corcyra had already been lost, brought under Illyrian control with a garrison installed to hold it. Epidamnus was under pressure. The network of Greek colonial communities that had, for generations, formed the civilized texture of Adriatic coastal life was under assault from a kingdom that recognized no limit to what could be extracted from the sea. These appeals were not abstract diplomatic communications. They were testimony from communities watching their centuries of accumulated stability being dismantled, and they were addressed to a Rome that had recently demonstrated it could fight at sea and prevail. What made the Greek appeals particularly effective was the way they intersected with Roman commercial interests. Issa's petition and the reports of Italian merchant losses were not separate problems requiring separate responses. They were manifestations of the same underlying reality, that Teuta's Illyria had become a destabilizing force across the entire upper and central Adriatic, affecting Greek colonists and Italian traders alike, disrupting commercial networks that connected both worlds. Rome could not protect its own merchant interests in that sea without also engaging the broader problem. The two imperatives pointed toward the same response. The Senate debated this in 230 and 229 BC, with the full awareness that what was being discussed was genuinely unprecedented. Every war Rome had fought before had been, fundamentally, a war on Italian soil or adjacent to it, a war where Rome was defending or extending a peninsula it already understood as its natural domain. Crossing the Adriatic to project force into Illyrian territory was something different in kind, not merely in scale. It meant accepting that Rome's sphere of responsibility extended beyond the water, that the sea was not a boundary but a space through which Roman power could and should move when Roman interest demanded it. Some historians have framed this as the defining question of the moment. Was Rome a peninsular power, bounded by its coastlines, or was it something more expansive, a force capable of projecting itself across water to impose order on distant shores? The Senate's eventual answer would reshape the Mediterranean world, but at this stage the question was still genuinely open, and the men deliberating it were aware they were standing at a threshold. The response Rome chose first was not military. Before assembling legions and launching ships, the Senate reached for negotiation, a recognition, perhaps, that the situation still seemed addressable through diplomacy, or perhaps a calculation that sending envoys was the appropriate first step in any case, establishing Roman standing in the affair before committing to the vastly more expensive proposition of war. The brothers Gaius and Lucius Coruncanius were selected for the mission, experienced men, the sons of a respected Roman family, sent with the authority of the Senate behind them and instructions to present Rome's grievances directly to Teuta and demand that the attacks on merchants and Greek allies cease. It was Rome's first formal diplomatic engagement with an Adriatic power across the water, and its significance was understood on both sides. The Coruncanius brothers were not merely messengers, they were an embodiment of Roman seriousness. The Senate announcing, through the choice of respected envoys and the formal weight of the commission, that it was now paying attention to the Eastern Sea and expected to be taken seriously in return. Whether Teuta understood the full implications of what that attention might lead to is harder to say. She had built her kingdom's power on the conviction that the Adriatic belonged to those bold enough to take from it, and that the complaints of merchants and colonists were simply the noise that successful naval power generated in its wake. She had not yet encountered a response that forced her to revise that conviction. The Coruncanius brothers set sail across the Adriatic toward Teuta's court, carrying with them Rome's first formal claim to a role in ordering the Eastern Sea. Behind them, in Rome, the Senate waited to learn whether the world beyond the water would accept that claim peacefully, or make the harder answer necessary. They found Teuta not at a fixed court but in the field, still conducting the siege of Issa when the Roman envoys arrived. That detail alone carries weight. A queen who received foreign ambassadors while simultaneously prosecuting a military campaign was not a ruler inclined toward diplomatic deference. The Coruncanius brothers had crossed the Adriatic bearing the Senate's formal authority, but they were entering a world ordered by different rules, and the encounter that followed would become one of the most consequential diplomatic failures in the ancient Mediterranean record. Polybius is the primary source for what happened in that meeting, and his account, written roughly half a century after the events, shapes everything that came after it. According to his telling, Teuta received the envoys and listened to their presentation of Roman grievances, the attacks on Italian merchants, the raids on allied communities, the disruption of Adriatic commerce, and then responded with what Polybius describes as an insolent and disdainful air. Her reply was essentially a statement of Illyrian constitutional principle. It was not the custom of Illyrian sovereigns, she said, to bind private persons from taking booty at sea, what Rome called piracy, Teuta called tradition. Teuta, what Rome demanded as redress, she dismissed as interference in the domestic arrangements of an independent kingdom. The raids were not acts of state that she could halt on foreign request. They were the customary practices of her people, and they lay outside the scope of what a sovereign ruler was expected to control or apologize for. This is where the exchange turns sharp, and where the ancient sources invite us to watch something more than a diplomatic negotiation. The younger of the Roman envoys, unnamed in Polybius but traditionally associated with Lucius Coruncanius, replied to Teuta's position with a bluntness that was either principled courage or calculated provocation, depending on how generously you read it. His response, as Polybius records it, was a declaration of Roman purpose barely wrapped in diplomatic form. The Romans, he said, had a most excellent custom of using the state to punish private wrongs and to redress private grievances, and they would endeavour, God willing, to compel Teuta to improve the relations between the sovereign and the subject in Illyria. It was not a request. It was not a warning. It was a statement of what Rome intended to do regardless of her response, delivered to her face, in her own camp, while she was in the middle of conducting a siege. The room, or tent, or whatever open-air space this confrontation occupied, had just become very small. What Polybius tells us next is that Teuta's fury, once ignited, was not contained by the usual conventions that surrounded the persons of ambassadors. She dismissed the envoys, and then, in what the narrative presents as an act of passionate irrationality rather than calculated policy, she dispatched men after them to kill the one who had used that plainness of speech. The Roman envoy was murdered. The other escaped, or so the account goes. Appian, writing later from a different tradition, adds an additional victim, the Isian envoy Cleomporus, who had accompanied the Romans and was killed alongside or near them. In Appian's version, the murders took place not during or immediately after the audience, but on the voyage, when Illyrian lemboy overtook the ambassador's ship, suggesting that the killing had a more operational character than a spontaneous act of rage would imply. These diverging accounts are not trivial differences in detail. They open a genuine historical question that scholars have not fully resolved, and they deserve careful treatment. If Teuta ordered the killing in a moment of fury following the audience, the episode reads as a catastrophic failure of self-control by a ruler who let personal anger override the foundational principle that ambassadors operated under diplomatic protection. If the deaths occurred on the water at the hands of Illyrian raiders acting independently, or even acting on prior standing orders that simply continued without specific royal direction, then Teuta's personal responsibility becomes more ambiguous, and the narrative of passionate feminine irrationality that Polybius constructs around the scene becomes rather more suspect. Ancient writers were not neutral recorders, and the framing of Teuta as a woman undone by womanish passion is precisely the kind of characterization that served Roman audiences far better than it served historical accuracy. What Polybius is doing in this scene, and what Appian and Cassius Dio do in their own ways, is constructing a moral confrontation. Teuta represents the barbaric world that does not recognize the universal norms of diplomatic conduct, the ius gentium, the law of nations that Rome considered itself the custodian and enforcer of. The Roman envoy represents not merely Roman interest but Roman principle, the voice of a civilization that uses law rather than naked seizure to order its relations with others. The murder of an ambassador was not just a hostile act in ancient thinking, it was a transgression of something close to sacred obligation, a violation of the protections that had to exist if the ancient world was to function at all. By framing the killing as the product of Teuta's emotional volatility, Polybius simultaneously justifies the Roman military response that followed and diminishes Teuta as a serious political actor, reducing her from a ruler defending a coherent if aggressive state policy to a woman who lost her temper and murdered a Roman citizen. That framing should not be accepted without scrutiny, but neither should it be discarded entirely. Something happened to the Cruncanius brothers, or at least one of them. The death of a Roman envoy on a diplomatic mission was not an event Rome could absorb quietly, regardless of how it occurred or who ordered it. The distinction between a murder commanded by Teuta in rage and a murder carried out by Illyrian forces acting with general license mattered perhaps less to Rome's Senate than it does to modern historians. The result in either case was the same. A Roman ambassador was dead, killed by Illyrian hands during a mission that carried the authority of the Roman Senate. Whatever diplomatic space might have theoretically existed between Rome and Illyria collapsed with him. There is something worth pausing over in the exchange itself, stripped of its subsequent history and the shadow of the war that followed it. Teuta's position was not, on its own terms, incoherent. She was articulating something that resembled an early version of what we might call jurisdictional sovereignty, the right of a ruler to define the customary practices of her own people without foreign interference. The Roman envoy's response, however principled it sounds in Polybius's telling, was in essence a threat. Improve your behaviour or we will compel you to do so. That is not diplomacy in any recognisable sense of mutually negotiated accommodation. It is an ultimatum delivered from a position that Rome was not yet, at that precise moment, powerful enough in the Adriatic to enforce. Teuta's fury, if fury it was, may have had an element of genuine political calculation in it, the calculation of a ruler who had watched her kingdom grow powerful through aggressive action, and who had not yet encountered a consequence severe enough to suggest that the Roman threat was more than words. She was about to find out. The surviving envoy, Gaius Coruncanius in most reconstructions, though the ancient sources are inconsistent, made his way back across the Adriatic carrying news that the Senate had not expected to receive. The mission had not merely failed, it had ended with Roman blood spilled and Roman authority treated as something that could be dismissed with a sentence and then silenced with a blade. Whatever arguments the more cautious members of the Senate might have assembled for patience, for further negotiation, for the slower instruments of economic and diplomatic pressure, those arguments now had to contend with something viscerally impossible to talk past. The body of a Roman ambassador, killed in the performance of his duty, was not an abstraction the Senate could deliberate around indefinitely. The exact truth of what happened along that Illyrian coast, or in Teuta's war camp, will probably never be fully recovered from the conflicting testimonies of hostile sources writing decades after the fact. But the political consequence was immediate, concrete, and irreversible. Rome had sent envoys to seek peace, and at least one of them had not come home. The threshold the Senate had been approaching so carefully was now directly underfoot, and the question of what lay beyond it was about to receive its answer. The question itself has never been cleanly settled, and that fact matters as much as any proposed answer to it. We have the death, or deaths, of Roman ambassadors on an Illyrian coast, or Illyrian water, sometime around 230 BC, during a diplomatic mission that had already gone badly in the room. Beyond that agreed skeleton of events, the ancient sources begin to diverge in ways that cannot be reconciled through careful reading alone. They reflect different agendas, different traditions, and different centuries, and sorting through them is not an exercise in finding the single true version hiding beneath the noise. It is an exercise in understanding how ancient history actually worked, how events were recorded not as they happened, but as they were useful to remember. Polybius, writing in the mid-2nd century BC, is the earliest and in most respects the most detailed surviving account. His version places the killing firmly on Teuta's orders, presenting it as a direct consequence of the audience. After the younger Coruncanius delivered his pointed warning about Roman intentions, Teuta, in Polybius's telling, was seized by anger and dispatched men to kill the envoy who had spoken with such plainness. One Roman ambassador was murdered, the other escaped. The chain of command in Polybius runs directly from Teuta's temper to the blade. This is a state-ordered killing presented as an act of irrational feminine fury, and that combination of political and psychological characterization is deliberate. Polybius elsewhere attributes Teuta's entire conduct during this period to a woman's natural shortness of view, a phrase that tells us considerably more about Polybius's assumptions than about Teuta's actual decision-making. He is a Greek historian writing in Rome for Roman patrons, explaining how Roman intervention in Illyria was not merely justified but necessary, and a queen undone by her own passions serves that narrative with elegant efficiency. Appian, writing in the 2nd century AD, more than 2 centuries after the events themselves, presents a meaningfully different picture. In his account, Illyrian ships attack the ambassadors not in some immediate aftermath of the audience, but on the water during their voyage, overtaking the embassy's vessel and killing both the Roman Coruncanius and the Isian envoy Cleomporus, who had been accompanying the Roman mission as a representative of Issa's interests. This is no longer a spontaneous act of rage ordered in a throne room. This is a maritime attack, conducted by lemboi, the swift shallow draft vessels that were the signature instruments of Illyrian sea power. The implication in Appian's framing is that the ships were operating according to their own patterns of raiding and engagement, rather than under specific royal instructions to eliminate the Romans. The killings could have been the work of commanders acting within the broad license that Illyrian state policy extended to seaborne raiders, violence that was state-sanctioned in general without necessarily being state-directed in this particular case. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century AD, adds yet another layer of remove. His account in the Roman history confirms that Roman envoys were killed by Illyrians, and that this killing justified war, but he provides no meaningful detail about how the order was given or who gave it. The episode in Dio becomes a generalized act of barbarian aggression, Illyrians kill Romans. Rome responds with overwhelming force. The outcome is civilization asserting itself over lawlessness. The narrative is morally legible and historically thin. Dio's version, stripped of specificity, is not really about Teuta at all. She's a cipher in it, a label for the force that Rome needed to correct. Florus, another later Roman writer, echoes the moralizing framework. Teuta becomes a stock figure of the pirate queen. Her crimes against Rome framed as crimes against the natural order of the Mediterranean world. These are traditions built on top of Polybius, amplified and simplified through each successive retelling until the woman becomes a symbol before she becomes a ruler. The Oxford Classical Dictionary's entry on Teuta notes with admirable restraint that the embassy of the Coruncanius brothers may have reached her, that the death of a Roman envoy at the hands of Illyrian forces provided Rome's casus belli, and that the exact chain of command remains disputed. That scholarly caution is not timidity. It is an accurate reflection of what the sources actually allow us to claim. The number of Roman ambassadors who died is itself inconsistently reported. Polybius focuses on one death, a single Roman envoy killed on Teuta's orders, with a companion who escaped. Appian's version includes both a Roman and a Greek envoy dying in the same attack. These are not the same event rendered from different angles. They are genuinely different accounts, and the difference in casualty count affects the nature of what occurred. A single targeted assassination ordered after a contentious audience is one kind of act. A naval attack on a diplomatic party that kills multiple envoys from different states is another. The former implies a personal vendetta, or a calculated attempt to silence a specific voice of opposition. The latter implies something more systemic, the machinery of Illyrian maritime aggression continuing to operate in waters where diplomatic immunity was either not recognized or not enforced. Amala Badrich's scholarly analysis of Polybius's passage identifies the gendered framework running through the Greek historian's account as an interpretive strategy rather than a straightforward description. Polybius needed Teuta to be inadequate, because her inadequacy was the premise that made Roman intervention legible as something other than imperial expansion. A strong ruler exercising coherent policy in defense of her kingdom's interests presents a different moral picture than a woman governed by short-sightedness and passion. By casting the murder of the Roman envoy as an emotional outburst rather than a rational decision, Polybius does two things simultaneously. He explains why Teuta's action was self-defeating, and he ensures that readers understand the action as characteristic of a certain kind of ruler. Female, barbarian, incapable of the measured judgment that Mediterranean civilization required. The portrait is too useful to its author to be taken at face value. None of this means Teuta was innocent, or that the killings were entirely unconnected to her authority. The Illyrian system that she had maintained and expanded was specifically organized around the right to take plunder at sea, and that system operated with the sanction of her court. If Illyrian forces killed the Roman ambassadors, they did so in a context where such violence was not merely tolerated, but institutionally normalized. Whether Teuta pointed at specific individuals and said kill them, or whether her forces operated according to a general mandate that treated foreign ships on Illyrian waters as legitimate prey, the political accountability runs back to her regardless. The difference matters for understanding her psychology and her decision-making, but it may matter less for understanding the consequences. Rome did not require certainty about the chain of command in order to act. It required a justification that the Senate could present to the Roman people, and the death of an ambassador, a figure whose protection was considered close to inviolable in the ancient world, provided that justification with exceptional clarity. The question of whether Teuta personally ordered the killing, or whether Illyrian forces acted within a broadly licensed mandate was, for Rome's purposes, a distinction without political consequence. An ambassador was dead. Another had barely escaped. The insult to Roman authority was not something that diplomacy could now address. The instrument of diplomacy had itself been destroyed. This is how history gets written and how wars get justified. An event occurs in conditions of genuine ambiguity. The surviving accounts render it in terms that serve their author's purposes. The moral framework hardens around the most useful version of the story, and the uncertainty at the centre, who gave the order, how many died, what exactly happened on that stretch of Adriatic water, becomes buried beneath the weight of what followed, because what followed was enormous, and the story of what provoked it had to be proportionate to the response. Teuta became the pirate queen who murdered Roman ambassadors because Rome needed that story to be true, and Polybius gave Rome a version of it that would last 2,000 years. What the record actually preserves, if you look carefully, is not certainty but consequence. Someone died. The sea between Italy and Illyria had just become a theatre of war. The sea between Italy and Illyria had become a theatre of war. Now Rome had to fill that theatre. What followed the death of the Coruncanius envoy and the outrage it produced in the Senate was not an improvised reaction or a punitive raid assembled in haste. It was something Rome had never quite attempted before, a deliberate, organised projection of military force across open water, aimed at a foreign power on the far shore of a sea that Roman armies had never crossed in formation. The Senate voted for war, the consuls were given their mandate, and the machinery of the Roman Republic turned itself toward a problem that required not just soldiers but ships, not just legions but the logistical imagination to move those legions somewhere they had never been. The fleet that assembled at Brundisium in the summer of 229 BC was, by any standard of the ancient world, a serious instrument of state power. Ancient sources give us a figure of roughly 200 ships, a number that blends purpose-built transport vessels with accompanying warships. The exact proportion between troop carriers and combat galleys varies depending on which account you consult, but the total is consistent enough across traditions to be treated as broadly reliable. Alongside those ships, the consuls had gathered approximately 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, soldiers who would need to be loaded onto transports with their equipment, their horses, their weapons, their grain, and everything else that a campaign of uncertain duration on foreign soil would require. The horses alone represented an extraordinary logistical burden, animals that do not board ships willingly, that require constant feed and water, that take up space disproportionate to their number, and that arrive on the far shore stressed, dehydrated, and in need of time to recover before they can function as military assets. Moving 2,000 of them across the Adriatic was not an afterthought. It was a problem that required planning and resources Rome had never previously applied to a sea crossing of this scale. Brundisium, modern Brindisi, on the heel of the Italian boot, was the logical embarkation point precisely because it offered the shortest viable crossing of the Adriatic. From there to the Illyrian coastline was a matter of hours under favourable winds, not days of open ocean sailing. But favourable winds on the Adriatic cannot be taken for granted. The sea is notorious for its bora, the cold, violent northern wind that can build from calm to dangerous within the space of an afternoon, and that has wrecked ships in those waters for as long as ships have sailed them. Roman commanders would have known that the crossing, though short in distance, carried its own risks entirely separate from whatever awaited them on the other shore. The timing of the expedition, the summer sailing season, when winds are more predictable and the sea less hostile, reflects a strategic awareness that this kind of operation demanded not just military preparation, but meteorological patience. The scale of the undertaking mattered as symbolism as much as it mattered as logistics. 200 ships crossing the Adriatic was not a message that could be misread. Every coastal community along the eastern shore, every Illyrian garrison commander watching the horizon, every Greek colony that had spent years paying tribute to Illyrian raiders or watching Illyrian lemboi work their harbours for plunder, all of them saw the same thing when that fleet hove into view. Rome had come. Not an embassy, not a warning, not a diplomatic gesture that could be dismissed with contempt. Rome itself, in the form of 2 consular armies and enough ships to darken the water, had crossed the sea. The contrast with Illyrian naval power was immediate and structural. Agron had built his maritime kingdom on the Lembus, a shallow draught, oar-powered galley, fast and manoeuvrable, designed for the kind of coastal raiding and rapid assault that had made Illyrian sea power so difficult to counter. These were excellent vessels for their intended purpose. Under Agron, the Illyrian fleet had reportedly numbered around 100 of them, each crewed for speed and violence, capable of moving through waters that heavier ships could not easily navigate. They were instruments of predation, built for a mode of warfare that relied on surprise, local knowledge, and the ability to strike and withdraw before a larger opponent could organise a response. What they were not built for was a conventional naval engagement against a Roman fleet of 200 ships carrying 22,000 soldiers. The asymmetry was not merely numerical, it was architectural and strategic. The Lembus was a weapon of opportunity, suited to a loosely organised maritime power that operated through initiative and dispersal. The Roman fleet at Brundisium was a weapon of mass and coordination, suited to a state that understood war as a problem of supply chains, reinforcement, and the systematic reduction of enemy positions. These were not two comparable naval forces meeting on equal terms. They were two entirely different conceptions of seaborne power, and the encounter between them would settle, with some finality, which conception was adequate for the world the Mediterranean was becoming. Polybius, who understood strategic history as well as any ancient writer, notes the significance of the Roman crossing explicitly. Roman forces crossed the Adriatic for the first time, he observes, and his framing makes clear that he understood this as a threshold moment rather than simply a military campaign. For him, writing in the 2nd century BC with the full arc of Roman expansion visible behind him, the first crossing of the Adriatic was the opening move in a sequence that would eventually take Roman armies to Macedonia, to the Greek East, to North Africa and Spain and beyond. The Adriatic crossing was not the largest or the most strategically consequential expedition Rome ever mounted, but it was the first, and first in history carry a weight that later, larger repetitions of the same act can never quite recover. There is something worth pausing on in the sheer novelty of what the Roman Republic was doing in the summer of 229 BC. Rome had fought wars on the Italian peninsula for generations. It understood siegecraft and formation warfare and the management of supply and overland campaigns, but the sea had not been Rome's domain in the way it was, say, Carthage's domain, or the domain of the great Hellenistic fleets that had spent the preceding century contesting the eastern Mediterranean. Rome's navy had grown through the Punic Wars of the previous decades. The First Punic War had forced the Republic to build a major fleet and develop the tactical doctrines to use it, but even that experience had been concentrated in the waters west of Italy, around Sicily and Sardinia. The Adriatic was different water, pointing toward a different world. The Greek East, the Hellenistic kingdoms, the complex political geography of an Aegean basin where Rome had not yet been a significant presence. The crossing of 229 BC pointed in that direction, even if no one standing on the deck of a Roman transport ship could fully see where the trajectory was leading. What they could see was the Illyrian coast resolving out of the haze, the same coastline that had absorbed Roman merchant ships into piracy for years, the same sea that had produced the incident, whatever its precise chain of command, that had ended the life of a Roman ambassador and made the Senate's decision for war unanimous in its fury. The fleet moved, the soldiers crossed, the horses were coaxed aboard and ferried over, the logistics held together through the kind of institutional competence that distinguished Roman military organization from the more improvised arrangements of its opponents. And on the far shore, the kingdom that Agron had built and Teuta had inherited found itself confronting something it had no real framework for. Not a raiding party to be outrun, not a colony to be pressured into tribute, not a diplomatic mission to be insulted or worse. It confronted an army that had crossed an entire sea to deliver Rome's answer to the question of who owned the Adriatic. The question was about to be answered with considerable force. The answer came quickly, not because Roman legions were invincible in the field, but because the political architecture that held Illyrian power together turned out to be far more fragile than the military architecture that expressed it. The fleet that had crossed the Adriatic from Brundisium made its first significant landfall at Corcyra, the large island sitting at the southern entrance to the Adriatic like a stopper in a bottle. Corcyra had been under Illyrian control, its harbour functioning as one of the forward positions from which Teuta's forces could threaten both the western Greek colonies and the sea lanes running south toward the open Mediterranean. Taking it would be strategically decisive, and here, before a single major battle had been fought, something happened that would define the entire arc of the campaign. Not a clash of arms, but a conversation. Demetrius of Pharos was an Illyrian commander, the man Teuta had installed as governor of the island of Pharos, a position of genuine trust and real military responsibility. His loyalties, however, were more elastic than his title suggested. Whether his falling out with Teuta was personal, political, or simply a cold calculation about which side of a very large fleet he wanted to stand on when the Romans arrived, the outcome was the same. He negotiated secretly with the Roman commanders, the consul Gnaeus Fulvius Centumalus coordinating the fleet, Lucius Postumius Albinus commanding the land forces, and he helped deliver Corcyra to them without the costly siege that a defended port would have required. In return, the Romans confirmed his governorship of Pharos and extended his authority along nearby stretches of coast. He would go on to serve as something close to a Roman advisor on Illyrian affairs, a man who knew the coastline, the garrison placements, the internal politics, and the personal relationships that structured Illyrian power, and who was now directing all of that intimate knowledge against the woman who had entrusted him with it. The defection of Demetrius of Pharos was not simply a military setback for Teuta, it was the first crack in something more fundamental, the network of trust and reciprocal obligation through which the Ardean kingdom maintained its coherence. Illyrian power had never been monolithic. It was a confederation of relationships, a structure in which local governors, client tribes, and allied cities were bound to the centre by a mixture of self-interest, fear, and the expectation that the centre could protect them. Demetrius had calculated correctly that the centre could not protect him from what was now crossing the Adriatic. Other people along the coast made the same calculation in quick succession. The Roman advance moved northward with a momentum that owed as much to surrenders as to victories. Epidamnos, one of the great port cities of the eastern Adriatic, accepted Roman protection. Apollonia, whose merchants had been among those most aggressively raided by Illyrian pirates in the years leading up to the war, did the same. Issa, the Greek island colony that had been under active Illyrian siege when the Roman fleet arrived, effectively asking Rome for help through the embassy it had sent earlier, found the siege lifted and Roman guarantees extended over its harbour. The Atintani and the Partheni, inland tribal confederations whose cooperation had given the Ardean kingdom strategic depth into the Balkan interior, formally surrendered to the Roman commanders. One by one, the nodes of Teuta's network detached themselves and reattached to Rome. What this process reveals, if you look at it from a political rather than a military angle, is something important about how Illyrian power had been constructed, and how quickly it could dissolve under pressure. The Ardean kingdom had expanded rapidly under Agron, perhaps too rapidly, acquiring client relationships and tributary agreements faster than it could consolidate them into anything resembling durable loyalty. The cities and tribes that accepted Roman protection in 229 BC were not, for the most part, defeated in battle. They made choices. They looked at the Roman fleet anchored in their harbours, looked at the shrinking horizon of Illyrian capacity to defend them, and concluded that their interests were better served by an arrangement with Rome than by continued association with a power that could no longer offer them the thing that mattered most, security. Teuta's position shrank with each defection. The coastal infrastructure that had made Illyrian piracy possible, the harbours for refuelling, the beaches for careening hulls, the local sympathisers who sheltered raiding parties and helped move plunder into trade networks, all of this depended on the willing cooperation of communities that were now placing themselves under Roman protection. Without those communities, the Illyrian fleet lost the forward operating bases that gave it range and reach. The lemboi that had terrorised the Adriatic for years were fast and dangerous, but they needed somewhere to go. Rome was systematically eliminating somewhere. There is a pattern worth recognising here that would repeat itself across centuries of Roman expansion. The military defeat is usually the culmination of a political process, not the cause of it. By the time Roman forces were in a position to besiege Teuta in her capital, the siege was almost a formality, a military ratification of a political reality that had already been decided by the cascading defections of the preceding weeks. Teuta had not simply lost battles, she had lost the human geography of her kingdom, the network of relationships that translated territorial control into actual power. The Illyrian queen, or regent, as the sources allow us to argue in either direction, retreated toward Rhizon, a fortified town in the deep recesses of the Gulf of Kotor, the almost inland sea carved by mountains from the Adriatic proper. Rhizon, whose name survives today in the modern Montenegrin city of Risan, was a defensible position precisely because of its geography. The mountains behind it were severe, the approach by sea was constricted, and the Romans would need to commit to a prolonged siege rather than a rapid assault. But even this retreat narrated the story of collapse. Teuta was no longer projecting power across the Adriatic. She was protecting herself from a Roman army that had followed her to the end of the navigable coast. The speed of the unraveling is worth pausing on. The Roman expedition had crossed the Adriatic in the summer of 229 BC. By the campaigning season's end, the coastal cities had submitted, the inland tribes had surrendered, the island positions had been taken or handed over, and Teuta's effective authority had contracted from a maritime kingdom spanning hundreds of miles of Adriatic coastline to a mountainous enclave around Scodra and Reason. Agron had spent years building what she was watching disintegrate in a matter of months. The military dimension mattered, of course. Rome's 200 ships and 22,000 soldiers were not an abstract threat, and the Illyrian lemboy had no meaningful answer to a consular fleet of that size, but it would be a mistake to explain the collapse as purely military. Demetrius's betrayal handed the Romans not just an easy first victory at Corcyra, but a trusted local guide through the political and military terrain of the kingdom. The surrenders of the coastal cities removed the supply network on which Illyrian sea power depended. The defections of the Atintani and the Partheni stripped away the inland buffer that had given the Ardean state its strategic depth. Each loss accelerated the next, because what was really collapsing was confidence. The confidence of Teuta's clients and allies that their relationship with her offered more than their relationship with Rome. She had inherited a kingdom from Agron. She had expanded it, defended it, and fought to preserve it against the most formidable opponent the Adriatic world had produced. But she had also inherited its structural vulnerabilities, the shallow roots of a maritime empire built on speed and intimidation rather than deep integration, on a confederation of interests rather than a consolidated state. When Rome arrived with enough force to make intimidation irrelevant, and enough patience to offer those interests a better arrangement, the confederation came apart. What remained for Teuta was the question of terms, and the harder question of what was left of her authority to negotiate them. The final act of the campaign crystallized around two places, Scodra and Rhizon, one representing the formal centre of what remained of Teuta's kingdom, the other the refuge she had chosen for herself as that kingdom contracted around her. Scodra, the Illyrian capital, sat inland, positioned where the Bojana River drains southward from Lake Scodra toward the sea. It was a city of genuine strategic importance, defensible, inland enough to make a naval assault irrelevant, and symbolically weighted as the seat of Ardean power. When Roman forces moved against it in the spring of 228 BC, they were not simply taking another town. They were reaching for the thing that would force a final reckoning. Teuta did not hold Scodra. She had retreated to Rhizon before the Roman noose tightened, withdrawing with a small retinue into that deep mountain harbour where the geography itself offered protection. Rhizon, tucked at the innermost reach of the Gulf of Kotor, was the kind of place that demanded patience from any attacker. Confined approaches, steep terrain, a position where the defender's knowledge of the mountains counted for more than the attacker's numerical superiority. Teuta understood this. After watching her coastal network disintegrate with remarkable speed, she had chosen ground where she could survive rather than ground where she could win. The siege of Scodra, then, fell not on Teuta personally, but on the capital she had already abandoned, and this distinction matters. What Rome was besieging was the symbol of Illyrian institutional power, the seat from which the Ardean kingdom projected its authority over the surrounding tribes and client communities. Taking it would not capture the queen, but it would make the political statement that needed to be made, that there was nowhere in Illyria that Rome could not reach, no claim to sovereignty that Roman arms could not contest. The fall of Scodra did not end the campaign dramatically in the manner of a great battle or a legendary last stand. It ended it administratively, politically, as the logic of the situation worked itself to its inevitable conclusion. The capital was taken. The kingdom's institutional architecture had been dismantled. There was nothing left to defend except the personal safety of a ruler whose realm had already been reduced to the rocky enclave around her. Teuta negotiated. This fact alone deserves recognition. Whatever the ancient sources say about her, and they say it with considerable bias, she maintained enough authority and composure in circumstances of genuine personal danger to conduct the formal process of ending the war on terms rather than simply surrendering at discretion. In 228 BC, she sent envoys to the Roman commanders and accepted a peace settlement that would reshape not just her own position, but the entire structure of Adriatic power for the generation that followed. The terms imposed on her were severe in their design, calibrated not merely to punish a defeated ruler, but to permanently alter the strategic geography of the Eastern Adriatic. Understanding that distinction is essential to understanding what Rome was actually doing in 228 BC, this was not punishment. It was architecture. Teuta was required to pay a fixed annual tribute to Rome. The ancient sources do not record the precise amount, and that silence is itself informative. The exact figure mattered less to subsequent historians than the principle it established, which was that Illyria now existed in a relationship of obligation to Rome rather than independence from it. Tribute was the material expression of a political reality. It meant that every year, forever or for as long as the arrangement held, Illyrian wealth would flow toward Rome, and the continuation of Teuta's authority over whatever remained of her territory would depend on the regularity of that flow. This was how Rome managed defeated powers, not always by destroying them outright, but by binding them into a structure of dependency that made future resistance both more costly and less likely. The territorial losses were extensive. Teuta renounced all claims to the southern reaches of Illyricum. Corcyra, Pharos, Issa, and Epidamnus passed from Illyrian authority into the Roman sphere, most of them confirmed as protectorates whose relationship with Rome had already been established during the campaign itself. Everything south of Lissus, the modern Albanian city of Leisure, was gone. The kingdom that Agron had built through years of military expansion and maritime aggression was amputated at its most economically and strategically vital point. The southern ports were where the wealth was, where trade concentrated, where plunder had been converted into negotiable value, where the relationships with Greek commercial networks had given Illyrian power its financial depth. Losing them was not merely a territorial concession, it was a structural dismemberment. But the clause that revealed Rome's deepest strategic intention was the naval restriction. Under the terms of the settlement, Teuta was prohibited from sailing south of Lissus with more than 2 galleys, and those ships were required to be unarmed. 2 unarmed vessels. That was the sum total of what remained of a maritime force that had terrorized the Adriatic for years, that had besieged island colonies, and sacked coastal towns and preyed on merchant shipping from the heel of Italy to the harbours of Greece. 2 unarmed galleys south of Lissus. This was not a punishment. Punishments wound. This was an amputation, carefully targeted at the specific capability that had made Illyrian power dangerous. Rome had not crossed the Adriatic simply because Roman citizens had been killed or Roman merchants had been robbed. Rome had crossed the Adriatic because a coherent maritime power operating from the eastern shore of that sea posed a structural threat to Roman commercial and strategic interests, and Rome was now ensuring that it could never do so again. The 2-galley clause was a permanent prohibition on the reconstruction of Illyrian sea power. It foreclosed not just the present threat, but any future attempt to rebuild what Teuta's fleet had represented. Consider what was being prohibited. The lemboi that had defined Illyrian naval tactics were fast, numerous, and operated in swarms. Their effectiveness depended on volume and coordination. 2 unarmed vessels were not a fleet. They were barely a symbolic presence on the water. The restriction also denied Illyria the ability to police its own coastline south of Lissus, to protect its own shipping, to conduct trade with any military credibility behind it. By controlling how many armed ships could operate in specific waters, Rome was asserting a kind of maritime sovereignty over the Adriatic that had never previously existed, and it was doing so before Rome had any formal navy worth the name, before it had developed the institutional mechanisms of a maritime empire. The Illyrian War was teaching Rome what sea power meant, and the treaty that ended it was Rome's first attempt to codify that understanding in enforceable terms. What Teuta retained after the settlement was real, but diminished almost beyond recognition. She kept the northern Illyrian heartland, the rugged territory around Rizon, and the region immediately to the north. The kingdom that Pin nominally ruled, and Teuta presumably continued to manage in practical terms, remained a functioning political entity, recognized by Rome, paying tribute to Rome, and understood to exist at Rome's sufferance. This was not nothing. A reduced realm is still a realm. The mountains and the narrow harbour at Rizon were still hers. The tribal connections of the northern Ardean world still acknowledged Illyrian authority. Pins remained on the nominal throne, and the dynasty endured, at least in name. But the woman who had governed from a position of genuine maritime power, whose fleet had made the Adriatic itself a political instrument, whose piracy had been not criminal activity but a foreign policy, that Teuta had been erased by the terms of the settlement as thoroughly as if the treaty had reached into history and redacted her. What remained was a client ruler of a border territory, paying annual tribute to a power that had crossed the sea in 200 ships to teach her the limits of Adriatic ambition. The kingdom survived. The power it had once expressed did not. Demetrius of Pharos, the man whose betrayal had done so much to accelerate the collapse, walked away from the settlement with his governorship confirmed and his influence expanded. That particular irony the ancient sources do record, even if they do not dwell on it. What had just happened in the Adriatic was unprecedented in Roman history, and it is worth pausing to understand precisely why, not simply as a military footnote, but as one of those moments when the trajectory of an entire civilization quietly and irreversibly shifts direction. Rome in 229 BC was already a formidable land power. The legions had conquered and absorbed the Italian peninsula with a methodical, grinding efficiency that left no serious rival standing between the Alps and the Straits of Messina. But Rome was not, by any meaningful definition, a sea power. Its naval experience was recent and relatively shallow, most of it forged in the fires of the Punic Wars with Carthage. The idea of crossing open water with a full expeditionary force, 200 warships, 20,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and installing that force on the far shore of a sea that Romans had previously treated as someone else's domain, was genuinely new. The First Illyrian War was the first time the Roman Republic had ever projected military force beyond the Italian peninsula in a formal, sustained campaign. That crossing of the Adriatic in 229 BC was not merely a military operation. It was a statement about what kind of power Rome intended to become. The immediate justification was straightforward enough. Roman merchants had been plundered, Roman envoys had been killed, and Rome had been openly humiliated by a reply from Teuta that amounted to an assertion that piracy was Illyrian national policy and none of Rome's concern. These were genuine provocations, not manufactured ones, but the scale of Rome's response reveals that something larger was being decided than simply the question of who had killed the Coruncanius brothers. 200 warships sailing in formation across the Adriatic to enforce a protection zone and install a client ruler on the eastern shore. That was not proportional punishment for a diplomatic insult. That was the establishment of a new strategic geography, one in which Rome's interests did not stop at the water's edge. The Straits of Otranto were the key. That narrow passage between the heel of Italy and the Albanian coast was the gateway to the entire Adriatic, and Illyrian piracy had turned it into a toll road controlled by the wrong authority. Roman merchants trading with the Greek world, with Macedonia, with the eastern Mediterranean, every one of them passed through that gateway, and every one of them did so at the mercy of a maritime power that had demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to take what it wanted. Teuta's defeat was in significant part about Otranto. Controlling the eastern approaches to that strait, binding the coastal communities there into a Roman sphere of influence, and permanently reducing Illyrian naval capacity were the structural goals beneath the surface of the stated justifications. The peace settlement, with its 120-mile coastal zone from Lissus to Epirus, and its 2 unarmed vessel restriction, was not improvised. It was the engineered solution to a strategic problem that Rome had finally decided could no longer be deferred. And having solved it once, Rome discovered something important about solving it. The method worked. The combination of overwhelming naval force, rapid coastal operations, diplomatic relationships with threatened Greek cities, and a carefully calibrated peace settlement that reshaped the regional architecture without requiring permanent occupation. This was a template. It could be reused. A decade later, when Demetrius of Pharos began rebuilding Illyrian maritime power and testing the limits of his client relationship with Rome, the Republic sent another fleet and ran another version of the same campaign. The Second Illyrian War of 219 BC was, in its essential structure, a refinement of what the first campaign had established. The precedent held, but the implications reached much further than Illyria. The war against Teuta normalized something that Romans had previously regarded with suspicion. The idea of a standing naval commitment beyond Italian waters. A fleet in being, capable of projecting force across open sea, protecting trade routes, and policing distant coastlines. This was what the Illyrian campaigns began to make thinkable as a permanent feature of Roman power. In the generations that followed, that thinking would bear extraordinary fruit. The Macedonian Wars drew Roman legions further east along the exact corridors that the Illyrian campaigns had opened. Roman involvement in Greek affairs, which would eventually reshape the entire Hellenistic world, was made operationally plausible in part because Rome had already crossed the Adriatic and proven it could sustain military operations on the far shore. The road to Pydna, to Corinth, to the eventual annexation of Macedonia and Greece runs through the harbour at Corcyra, where Roman ships first dropped anchor in 229 BC. The anti-piracy dimension deserves particular attention. Teuta's defeat established a principle that Rome would return to repeatedly, that maritime predation affecting Roman commercial interests was not merely a criminal matter, but a political and military one, requiring a military solution. The First Illyrian War was the first formal expression of what would become one of Rome's most consistent naval doctrines, that the sea could not be left ungoverned, and that where it was ungoverned in ways that cost Rome, Rome would govern it by force. Pompey's famous sweep against Mediterranean piracy in 67 BC, when he cleared the entire sea of pirate fleets in a matter of months, using coordinated naval squadrons operating across multiple zones simultaneously, was in one sense the mature culmination of exactly the thinking that the Illyrian campaigns had pioneered. The institutional memory was different, the scale was vastly larger, but the underlying logic, that Roman commerce required Roman naval enforcement, and that piracy was a problem requiring organised state violence rather than ad hoc local responses, runs in a direct line from Teuta's defeat to Pompey's commission. Teuta, in a certain irony she would not have appreciated, helped teach Rome that sea power was worth having. There is also the question of what this meant for Rome's self-understanding. Polybius, writing about this period with the analytical precision that makes him such a valuable source even when his biases are visible, saw the Illyrian Wars as a turning point in Roman orientation toward the broader Mediterranean world. The Greeks and Macedonians, he noted, had previously paid little attention to Rome, regarding it as a powerful but geographically peripheral force whose ambitions were bounded by Italy. The arrival of Roman forces on the eastern Adriatic shore changed that perception fundamentally. Suddenly Rome was present in waters that touched the Greek world, and the coastal cities that had been grateful for Roman protection in 229 BC found themselves in a relationship with a power whose reach was longer and whose interests were wider than they had previously imagined. The embassy Rome sent afterward to the Aetolian and Achaean leagues, informing them of what had been accomplished in Illyria, effectively announcing Rome's arrival in the eastern Mediterranean as a player with standing, was a diplomatic statement as significant as the military campaign itself. Rome was not asking for recognition, it was providing notification. Teuta's defeat, then, sits at an extraordinary juncture. It was the end of something, the end of Illyrian maritime ambition, the end of the specific form of state-sanctioned piracy that Agron had developed and Teuta had extended, the end of the Adriatic as an ungoverned space where a middling power could operate without accountability to the larger forces gathering around it. But it was also the beginning of something far larger than itself, the beginning of Rome as a sea power with genuine projection capability, the beginning of Roman involvement in the Hellenistic East, the beginning of a Mediterranean-wide pattern of intervention and policing that would, over the following 2 centuries, transform the sea from a border between civilizations into a Roman lake. Teuta had not intended any of this. She had inherited a dynamic, expanding maritime kingdom and pursued the policies that had made it dynamic and expanding, and those policies had finally collided with a power that had the will and the resources to answer them definitively. That collision produced consequences neither side could have predicted. Rome went to war with Illyria to stop the bleeding from piracy on its trade routes, and to avenge a diplomatic murder that still carries historical ambiguity. What it discovered in the process was that crossing a sea was something it knew how to do, and that knowing how to cross a sea changed what was possible. The Rome that crossed the Adriatic in 229 BC returned home with a military victory. But a different kind of conquest had already been underway for years before the first Roman hull scraped the eastern shore. A conquest conducted not with warships and legions, but with words, with framing, with the slow institutional power of who gets to write the story and how they choose to tell it. What survives of Teuta is, in almost its entirety, the record of her enemies. The histories that describe her reign, her decisions and her personality were written by Greek and Roman authors, operating within cultural frameworks that had little interest in presenting an Illyrian queen as a rational statesperson making defensible political choices. Understanding what those sources actually say, and what they reveal about their own assumptions when they say it, is as important to grasping Teuta's story as any account of the battles themselves. Polybius is the foundational voice. Writing in the 2nd century BC, he is the earliest substantial source for the Illyrian Wars, and his account has shaped every subsequent telling of Teuto's story. Polybius was a careful historian by ancient standards, genuinely interested in causation and political mechanics, but he was also a man steeped in the assumptions of the Hellenistic Greek world, and writing with a clear appreciation for Roman power. His portrait of Teuta is damning, and it is damning in a very specific way. He does not simply describe her policies as misguided, or her war against Rome as strategically doomed. He attributes her failures explicitly to what he calls a woman's natural shortness of view. In Polybius's rendering, the problem with Teuta's rule was not its content, but its source. A woman in power, making the kind of impulsive, emotionally driven decisions that Polybius regarded as inherently female. The political logic of the Illyrian maritime state, the economic rationale for coastal raiding, the precedents set by Agron's reign that Teuta was largely extending rather than inventing, none of this enters his analysis. What enters instead is a gendered explanation that removes Teuta from the category of political actor and places her in the category of cautionary example. This matters because Polybius's framing has been enormously durable. Later Roman writers, Cassius Dio, Florus and others, adopted and amplified the same portrait. In their accounts, Teuta's piracy is not state policy, with identifiable economic and strategic rationales. It is irrational aggression, the behaviour of a barbarian queen who lacked the discipline and civilized restraint that Roman governance represented. The murder of the Coruncanius brothers, framed in these sources as either directly ordered by Teuta or the predictable product of the ungoverned brutality she presided over, becomes the expression of a character type rather than a contested diplomatic incident whose precise circumstances remain genuinely unclear. Roman readers needed a villain adequate to the war that followed. A calculating queen managing a complex maritime polity was not quite the right shape for that role. An arrogant, irrational woman who insulted Roman dignity and then murdered Roman envoys. That was a figure whose defeat could be presented as both just and inevitable. The ethnic dimension runs alongside the gender dimension throughout these texts. Polybius consistently frames the conflict as one between Illyrian barbarians, who operate outside the norms of law and civilization, and Romans who intervene to restore order and protect the innocent. The word barbarian carried real freight in this period. It placed Illyrians outside the community of peoples whose political arrangements deserved respect, whose diplomacy deserved to be taken seriously, whose sovereignty over their own sea lanes deserved recognition. When Rome crossed the Adriatic, it did so in these sources not as a conquering imperialist establishing a strategic foothold, but as a civilizing force answering a legitimate call for protection. That framing required the Illyrians to be portrayed as uncivilized, and it required Teuta to be portrayed as their emblem. Against this current stands Appian, writing in the 2nd century AD, who offers a notably different portrait. Appian is more careful than Polybius about Teuta's title, treating her consistently as a regent governing on behalf of her young stepson Pin, rather than as a queen in her own right, a distinction that, as modern scholars note, carries real implications for how her authority and her gender are to be read. A regent exercising temporary custodial power is a more politically conventional figure than a queen asserting sovereign rule, and Appian's version allows for a reading of Teuta that is more administratively legible. More striking still, Appian records Teuta's diplomatic overtures after the war, portraying her as seeking pardon and presenting herself as acting, in part, to address the consequences of her husband's deeds, a detail that introduces complexity and even a degree of sympathy entirely absent from Polybius. Contemporary scholars who have examined the ancient sources most carefully tend to regard Appian as the most measured and objective among them, precisely because his account makes space for a Teuta whose motivations are political rather than pathological. The work of modern scholarship has been to push back against the Polybian frame without simply inverting it. Amela Badgeric's 2014 analysis of Polybius's account of the Roman mission to Illyria examines specifically how gendered language operates in the text, how attributing Teuta's decisions to female irrationality serves the narrative function of naturalizing Rome's intervention and obscuring the political coherence of Illyrian maritime policy. The Oxford Classical Dictionary's entry on Teuta reflects the same scholarly caution, emphasizing that fundamental questions about her remain genuinely uncertain. whether the Roman envoys were killed on her direct orders or by independent pirate actors operating within the general framework she had authorized, how many envoys were involved, what her precise constitutional title was, and what authority it actually conferred. These are not minor footnotes. They are the load-bearing questions on which the entire justification for Rome's first overseas war rests, and the sources disagree about all of them. What the hostile histories most effectively obscure is the political logic that ran through Teuta's regime. Illyrian coastal raiding was not random violence. It was, as the evidence consistently suggests, a form of state-sanctioned economic extraction, a maritime policy that had been developing across multiple Illyrian rulers before Teuta inherited it, that had specific targets and specific commercial rationales, and that operated within a regional context where the line between legitimate naval interdiction and piracy was drawn by whoever held the relevant authority. Teuta did not invent this system. She administered and extended it. Calling her a pirate queen, a label that originates entirely in hostile external sources, applies a Roman and Greek legal category to an Illyrian political arrangement that operated by different frameworks, and then treats that categorization as though it were a neutral description rather than a political judgment made by the party that went to war with her. There is also the simple, irreducible problem of voice. Teuta left no texts. No Illyrian administrative records from her reign survive. No royal correspondence, no inscriptions in which she articulates her own understanding of her position, her policies, or the confrontation with Rome. Everything that passes for her words in the ancient record, including the famous reply to the Roman embassy about piracy being a matter of national custom, is mediated through sources who were either hostile to her or writing centuries after the fact with heavy reliance on those hostile sources. When Polybius puts words in Teuta's mouth, he is constructing a character that serves his narrative, not transcribing a diplomatic exchange. The Teuta who dismissed Roman concerns about Illyrian piracy as an affront to sovereign custom, and then, in the same breath, implied that the Roman envoy, speaking most forcefully, might not live to regret his boldness, that Teuta is a literary creation, shaped to fit the requirements of a story in which Rome's response was righteous and inevitable. Historiography does not merely record the past, it decides what the past contains. In Teuta's case, the decision was made by writers who needed her story to explain and justify a war that transformed the Mediterranean world, and who found in the figure of a foreign woman ruling an ungoverned sea the perfect materials for the explanation they required. Recovering the political reality beneath that explanation is the work of careful reading, deliberate skepticism, and the willingness to notice what the sources need to be true, and to ask whether the evidence stripped of its framing actually supports it. After the ancient sources fell silent, something quieter took over. Not the structured testimony of historians with access to official records and diplomatic accounts, but the unwritten inheritance of a region that remembered, in its own way, a queen who had ruled the sea. The most dramatic story about Teuta's end does not come from Polybius, or Appian, or any surviving classical text. It comes from Albanian folklore, preserved across generations in the mountain communities above the Adriatic coast. According to this tradition, Teuta did not fade into obscurity behind the terms of a humiliating treaty. She chose a different end, leaping from the cliffs of the Oian Mountains above Lipsi, near the old Illyrian settlement at Rasan, rather than endure the diminishment that followed her defeat. It is a story of tragic grandeur, a death that refuses surrender even when surrender had already been formally concluded, a final gesture of the same defiant sovereignty that had brought Rome to the Eastern Sea in the first place. The problem, historically speaking, is that none of this appears anywhere in the ancient record. No classical author mentions it. Polybius ends his account of the First Illyrian War with the peace settlement and moves on. Appian notes her diplomatic overtures and her formal submission. What happened to Teuta after 227 BC simply disappears from the written record that survives. The leap from Orient is a folk motif, not a documented event, a story that says everything about how later generations wanted to remember her and nothing that can be confirmed about how she actually died. Treating it as history would be a mistake, but dismissing it entirely would also miss the point. Folklore of this kind does not generate itself from nothing. It crystallizes around figures who matter, around people whose story a community needs to keep alive because the official written version, filtered through hostile foreign sources, was never quite sufficient to contain what they represented, and Teuta's name did stay alive. Through centuries in which Illyrian political structures had long since dissolved, in which the coastline she once commanded had passed through Roman, Byzantine, Venetian and Ottoman hands, the name persisted. It remained a given name in Albanian communities, carried generation after generation by women whose families were, in some sense, still holding the name in trust. Oral culture maintained a thread that the documentary record had dropped entirely until modern scholarship, nationalism and archaeology found each other in the late 20th century and began the work of recovery. That recovery took concrete form. In Durrës, the ancient Dyrrhachium that had lain just within the edge of Teuta's world, a bronze statue was installed on a public building in the 20th century, one of the earliest material monuments to her memory in modern Albania. Later, a more elaborate monument appeared in Tirana. Teuta depicted alongside her young stepson Pin, the figure on whose behalf she had ruled as regent, and whose existence complicated the question of her exact authority in ways the ancient sources never cared to resolve. A bust entered the collections of the Skanderbeg Museum. Her face, reconstructed and idealized in the way that public commemoration always involves some degree of artistic license, began to circulate in textbooks, in cultural events, in the shared visual vocabulary of Albanian national identity. The most striking of these commemorations may be the most understated. On the 1st of September in the year 2000, the Albanian state issued a 100 lek coin bearing Teuta's portrait on its reverse. A woman who appears in no surviving Illyrian inscription, whose face no contemporary image records, whose exact title scholars still dispute, placed on legal tender by a modern republic as a statement of heritage. The coin does not attempt to resolve the historical ambiguities. It makes a different kind of claim, that whatever the details, Teuta belongs to Albania's story of itself, and that the story is worth carrying in the literal currency of daily life. Football, that most durable mechanism for transmitting local identity across generations, made the same claim 80 years earlier. In 1930, the sports club in Durrës adopted the name KF Teuta Durrës in her honour, formally identifying itself as the inheritor of the Queen of Illyria's legacy. The club's supporters still call themselves the Boys of the Sea. The maritime dimension of Teuta's story, her command of Adriatic waters, her state-sanctioned use of the sea as a political instrument, embedded itself in the identity of a football club and survived there, waiting for the archaeological and historical interest that would eventually give the name its fuller context. That archaeological interest accelerated markedly in the late 20th century and into the 21st as Albanian scholars, international researchers and cultural institutions began investing seriously in the recovery and display of Illyrian history. Museum exhibitions, academic publications, and public statuary multiplied. A bust commissioned for educational and cultural distribution in 2021 reached a global audience through the World History Encyclopedia, a small but telling indicator of how thoroughly Teuta had migrated from the margins of ancient historiography into the mainstream of accessible history. The impulse behind these projects was partly scholarly and partly something hard to categorize, a national need to establish the antiquity and dignity of Albanian civilization by connecting it to the Illyrians, and to find in figures like Teuta the kind of sovereign agency that hostile ancient sources had systematically worked to deny. The theatrical world joined the effort. In 2020, a production titled The Return of Queen Teuta premiered in Zagreb, retelling her story with an emphasis that ancient sources would have found entirely foreign. Teuta as a figure of political tragedy, a ruler caught in the machinery of great power competition, a woman whose defeat was the product of structural forces rather than the innate irrationality that Polybius had diagnosed as her defining characteristic. Queen Teuta Days, cultural events celebrating her memory across Albania and the Albanian diaspora, gave the name a living calendar presence, anchoring her not just in museums and on coins, but in the ongoing rhythm of communal life. What makes Teuta such a persistent fascination, across such different media and such varied historical distances, is the way her story contains multiple compelling tensions at once. She was a ruler who appears in the sources as a pirate queen, someone who straddled the line between sovereign authority and outlaw status, who commanded a state whose primary instrument of power was the kind of maritime violence that civilization-oriented sources automatically coded as criminal. That tension is genuinely interesting. It refuses easy resolution, because the line between legitimate naval policy and piracy was in her time, as in others, a political determination made by the powerful rather than a neutral fact about the violence itself. Teuta operated in the space where sovereign right and raider practice overlapped, and the ancient world's most articulate voices decided to describe that space entirely from the perspective of the party that went to war to close it. Add to that the suicide legend, uncertain as it is, and the figure that emerges has the full shape of mythology. A queen who commanded the sea, who defied an empire, who was brought down not by superior wisdom or justice, but by superior numbers, and who chose, according to the tradition her own people preserved, to end on her own terms. Whether or not the leap from Orient happened, it is the story that the landscape held on to. The Adriatic coast, the mountains above the sea, the memory of a woman who had once made Rome nervous enough to build a fleet and cross the water, all of this persisted in names, in statues, in coins, in the chants of football supporters calling themselves the Boys of the Sea. The hostile histories framed her as a barbarian who had to be civilized into submission. Memory, working more slowly and without the authority of written record, constructed something different, a queen who met the full weight of Roman ambition and left an impression in the land that outlasted the empire that defeated her. So we return, at last, to the water. Everything in Teuta's story comes back to the Adriatic, that narrow, deceptively enclosed sea between Italy and the eastern coast, shallow in places, treacherous in weather, and in the 3rd century before the Common Era, the most consequential stretch of water in the Mediterranean world that Rome had not yet learned to think of as its own. Teuta changed that, not by inviting the change, not by welcoming Rome's attention, but by refusing to accommodate it. And in that refusal she pushed a land empire into becoming something it had never quite been before, a naval power with overseas ambitions. Trace the arc of what happened. Agron built the military and maritime foundation, a kingdom of Illyrian tribes organized around coordinated sea power, using the natural shelter of the Adriatic coast to sustain fleets that Greek colonial cities could not outmatch, and Italian merchants had no means to resist. When Agron died around 231 BC, Teuta inherited that apparatus. Her exact title, queen or regent, ruler in her own right or caretaker for her young stepson Pins, remained disputed even in antiquity and remains disputed now. What is not disputed is that she continued and extended the policy, directing Illyrian ships against Greek settlements like Issa and Phoenice, against the trade lanes that connected the Italian coast to the eastern Mediterranean, against the commercial interests that Rome, increasingly, could not afford to ignore. The ancient sources call it piracy. That word carried moral weight for Greek and Roman writers, marking Illyrian naval activity as something qualitatively different from Roman military campaigns or Greek colonial enforcement. But Teuta's policy was not random predation. It was the maritime expression of an Illyrian state using the tool it had, sea power, in the service of territorial expansion and economic extraction, much as Rome was using its legions on land. The distinction between legitimate state violence and piracy, in this period, was less a principled legal category than a political judgment made by whoever was strong enough to enforce it. Rome's first attempt to manage the situation diplomatically produced the most contested moment in the entire story. The Coruncanius brothers, Gaius and Lucius, Roman envoys sent in 230 BC to demand Teuta restrain her fleet, never completed their mission. One account, preserved through Polybius, says Teuta ordered their murder after one of them spoke to her with an insolence she was unwilling to accept. Cassius Dio records something less precise. Some were killed, some imprisoned, and the exact chain of command is harder to reconstruct. Whether the killing was a direct royal order, the action of commanders acting on general license, or the violence of pirates operating without specific instruction, the ancient sources cannot agree, and the disagreement matters because it determines whether Teuta bears personal responsibility for the act that became Rome's justification for war. What followed in 229 BC requires no qualification. Rome crossed the Adriatic with around 200 warships, 20,000 infantry, and 2,000 cavalry. It was an unprecedented projection of force, the first time a Roman army had crossed beyond the Italian peninsula in organised military campaign. Teuta's forces could not hold against that concentration of power. Her coalition fractured, Demetrius of Pharos defecting being the most consequential betrayal, and by early 228 BC, She was negotiating from the position of the defeated. The peace terms were severe: an annual tribute, the surrender of southern territories, a restriction to no more than 2 unarmed ships sailing beyond Lissus. The sea that had been her instrument of power was effectively taken from her, and yet the First Illyrian War is not remembered primarily as Teuta's defeat. It is remembered, by those who study the long architecture of Roman power, as the moment Rome looked east and did not look away again. The Adriatic crossing of 229 BC initiated a sequence of interventions: a Second Illyrian War, eventually the Macedonian Wars, the steady absorption of the Greek East, that unfolded over the following century and a half. All of it began, in some sense, with a regent on the eastern coast of the Adriatic who refused to treat Roman commercial interests as a constraint on Illyrian policy. Teuta did not choose to bring Rome to sea. She simply refused to surrender the sea before Rome arrived, and that refusal made the crossing necessary. The hostile histories that survive, Polybius above all, framed her in terms of feminine impulsiveness and barbarian unreason, the gendered and cultural vocabulary that ancient writers reached for when they needed to explain why someone in power had acted in ways that invited their own destruction. Whether those characterizations were fair, whether they accurately reflected the political calculations of a regent managing an inherited war state against a rising superpower, is something the surviving sources are too compromised to resolve. What regional memory preserved was something different: a ruler of sovereign bearing, a tragic figure whose story the landscape held in trust when the written record abandoned her. Both images, the reckless queen of Polybius and the defiant heroine of Albanian tradition, are partial. Neither captures the full, irreducibly complex figure who governed Illyria at the moment Rome first looked across the Adriatic and decided that the sea was not a boundary but an opportunity. She ruled, she commanded, she miscalculated, she lost. And the water she once commanded became the road by which empire travelled east.